the condo on the north end of Burlington, the one with the south-facing balcony and the Niagara escarpment visible through the tree line on clear mornings. I never bought it for myself. I bought it for the woman who set a bowl of lentil soup in front of me and handed me a spare key when my own father told me, without a tremor in his voice, that I was smart enough to figure things out on my own. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this story actually begins. Not the part where everything turns out. The part that still sits cold in my chest when November rolls around and the temperature drops off the lake. And I remember what it felt like to wake up in a car at 3 in the morning with numb feet and fog on every window. I was 27 years old, renting a one-bedroom in Hamilton's East End, near the foot of the escarpment, working full-time as receptionist at a dental clinic in Westdale, and picking up weekend shifts at a coffee counter near McMaster University. I wasn't thriving in any spectacular sense of the word, but I was meeting my obligations. Rent on time, hydro paid, food in the fridge. I was doing what a lot of people in that city were doing in those years, holding on with both hands and hoping the rope didn't get shorter. The letter came on a Thursday in November. My landlord had sold the building to a development company. The new owners were converting the units to condos. Under the Ontario Residential Tenancies Act, all tenants had 60 days to vacate and were entitled to 2 months' compensation. That sounds like a reasonable arrangement until you sit down and calculate what finding a replacement apartment actually requires in Hamilton in that market. First and last month's rent up front, a full credit check, proof of income demonstrating you earn, at minimum 3 times the monthly rent, and a willingness to sign a 12-month lease on a unit that costs more than the one you're already losing. I want to be clear about something. I had done nothing wrong. I had not missed a payment or damaged the property, or violated my lease in any way. I had simply been renting from someone who decided the building was worth more without tenants in it. That is a legal thing to do. I'm not here to argue about the law, but it left me with 60 days and not nearly enough runway. I spent 3 weeks applying for every listing I could find. Rent Faster, Kijiji, the Facebook rental groups that everyone in Hamilton knows and nobody admits to using, same story every time. The decent places in my budget wanted first and last, money I didn't have in any accessible way. The places that didn't require first and last had problems I could identify from the listing photos alone. I tried explaining my situation to one property manager. 2 jobs, stable income when you added them together, good rental history, and he told me, very politely, that he needed a single employer on file. 2 part-time positions read as precarious on paper, regardless of what they actually add up to. I heard some version of that 4 more times before I stopped making calls. So I did what most people do when the options run out and the walls start moving inward. I called my father. He lives in Mississauga, in a 4-bedroom detached house near Port Credit that he and my stepmother bought in the early 2000s, back when that neighborhood was still the kind of place where people like them could afford to be. They've been there for over a decade. The house has a finished basement, a 2-car garage, and a guest room with an ensuite that I know for a fact sits empty most of the year. Because my stepmother mentioned it every Christmas when she was lobbying for us to visit more often. I called him on a Sunday evening. I explained the situation from the beginning. The development notice, the apartment search, the dead ends. I told him I needed a place to stay for maybe 6 to 8 weeks, not money, not a solution to anything, just a room, temporarily, while I sorted out my next move. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Waverly, the timing is a bit difficult on our end right now." I asked what he meant. He said his in-laws were visiting in December, and they were planning to use the guest room during their stay. I did the math out loud. His in-laws' visit was in December. It was November 10th. I needed the room for 6 to 8 weeks, which meant mostly November and the first part of December. He didn't respond to the math. Then he said, "You're smart, Waverly. You always figure things out." I held the phone for a long moment, genuinely trying to determine if I had misunderstood him. Because what I was hearing was my father, sitting in his 4-bedroom house in Mississauga, telling me that the inconvenience of a conversation with his in-laws about the guest room was greater than the possibility of his daughter having nowhere to sleep in a Canadian November. But I had not misunderstood him. That is exactly what he said. I told him I'd manage. I said it without knowing whether it was true. Then I got off the phone and sat down on the floor of the apartment I was about to lose, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since my mother died. Not entirely from surprise. My father had always been the kind of person whose love had terms attached to it, even if those terms were never written down anywhere. But there is a difference between knowing someone has limitations and colliding with those limitations at the worst possible moment. That distance is the whole world. My older sister called 2 days later. She'd picked up the news through our family's grapevine, the one that transmits everything except the things that actually need transmitting. I thought, for a moment, that she might be calling to offer something. Instead, she said, "Didn't you just tell me your hours were picking up at the clinic?" They had, by 2 hours a week. I told her I was working on it. She said to let her know if I needed anything, in the particular tone people use when they're confident the offer won't be taken up. I thanked her and hung up. I spent my first 3 nights after the lease ended in my car, parked in the lot of a Canadian Tire on Barton Street, that had security lighting and enough overnight foot traffic that I didn't feel entirely exposed. I want to be honest about what those nights were actually like, because I've heard the way experiences like this get talked about afterward, smoothed into something instructive, something you look back on with a kind of rugged gratitude. That wasn't how it felt in the moment. It was cold. Not brisk. Not the invigorating kind of cold that people romanticize. November cold in the Hamilton Basin, the kind that comes off the lake and settles into your joints, and doesn't release until April. I had a sleeping bag rated to -10, and I was still waking up rigid and shivering by 3 in the morning. Starting the car to run the heat for 10 minutes, sitting there in the glow of the dashboard, watching my breath fog the windshield. Each morning I drove to work, and used the clinic bathroom to wash my face and fix my hair, and do whatever I could to look like a person who had slept somewhere normal. I don't know how convincing I was. Nobody asked. What I remember most clearly is not the cold or the physical discomfort, but the particular silence of it. The sense that the world had quietly processed your absence and moved on. That nothing was waiting for you anywhere. That you had slipped out of ordinary life. Out of a warm room, a door you could lock, a bed, and the slot had already closed behind you. That silence is something I've never fully forgotten, and I don't think I'm meant to. On the 4th night, my phone lit up with a text from a woman named Nettie. Annette, formally, though no one had called her that in 30 years. She had been our next-door neighbor in Dundas when I was growing up. Retired now from 32 years, as an administrative coordinator, with the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board. She was in her late 60s, living alone in the bungalow she'd shared with her husband, before he passed, on the dead-end street that backed onto the creek, where I used to catch crayfish after school. After my mother died when I was 16, Nettie had been one of the few people who kept showing up. Not loudly, not in ways that demanded acknowledgement, but consistently. A card on my birthday, every year, even after I'd moved 3 times. Groceries left on my father's porch in the months after the funeral. A text on the anniversary, every year without fail, that said only, "Thinking of you today." We'd exchanged a few messages over the summer. She knew, in the way that people know things, that things had not been easy for me. The text said, "Waverly, honey, I heard you're in a hard spot. I have a spare room and I mean it. Come stay." I read it 4 or 5 times. I was looking for the condition buried somewhere in the phrasing, the asterisk, the thing that would make the offer smaller than it appeared. There was nothing. It said exactly what it said. I drove to Dundas that same evening. She was at the front door before I'd turned off the engine. She looked at the bag over my shoulder and the state of my face, and she said, "Have you eaten anything today?" I hadn't, not a proper meal. She made lentil soup with crusty bread, and we sat at her kitchen table for almost 2 hours, while I talked, and she listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't try to reframe anything, or offer the silver lining she thought I should be looking for. She just sat with me in the actual weight of it, and every time my mug got low she refilled it, and when I finally ran out of things to say, she reached over and put her hand on mine and said, "The spare room's made up. There's an extra key on the hook by the side door. The thermostat in the hallway is finicky. I'll show you how it works. You stay as long as you need to." That was the whole speech. I slept in a real bed that night for the first time in 4 days. I cried again when I turned the lamp off, but not the desperate kind. The kind that happens when you have been holding yourself very tightly, for a very long time, and someone you trust catches you by surprise. That kind of crying means something different. It means you're safe. Nettie's house was small and warm and always smelled like something. Coffee in the morning, something baking by mid-afternoon, cedar sachets from the linen closet. She had her rhythms. CBC Radio 1 at 6, her walk along the creek path before breakfast, book club at the Dundas Library on Wednesday evenings, a phone call with her daughter in Victoria every Sunday after lunch. She folded me into all of it without once making me feel like a disruption. She set a place for me at every meal. She remembered how I took my coffee. When I had a hard day at work, she noticed from the way I came through the door, and she didn't press. She just made sure there was something good for supper, and let me come to it in my own time. I had lived with a lot of people in my 20s, in the patchwork way you do, when the rental market and your income don't quite reach each other. I had never once lived somewhere that felt this easy. Like I belonged in that kitchen, like being there was simply the obvious arrangement. About 3 weeks into my stay, she mentioned over breakfast, almost offhand, that a woman she'd worked alongside for years at the school board was quietly looking for someone to help manage a small portfolio of rental properties around Hamilton and Burlington. Tenant coordination, maintenance scheduling, administrative work, keeping the communication clear and the systems organized. Not a glamorous job description, but it was full-time with benefits, and the woman running the operation had a reputation for being fair and treating her staff like they had brains. She hasn't posted it anywhere yet, Nettie said, pouring herself more coffee. I was thinking of mentioning your name, if you'd be interested. One phone call. That is all it was. Nettie picking up the phone and telling someone she trusted that she knew a young woman who was organized and reliable and ready to work. That single phone call is the thread that runs from the parking lot of that Canadian Tire in November, directly to every good thing that has happened to me since. I got the position. I started in January. The work suited me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The details came naturally. Lease renewals, maintenance tracking, contractor schedules, tenant communications. What also came naturally was understanding the people on the other end of those calls. The tenants in difficult situations. The ones who were scared or confused or caught in circumstances that had made ordinary things suddenly very hard. I knew what that felt like from the inside. I knew it in my body. That understanding turned out to matter more than any formal credential I could have brought to the role, and it showed up every day in the job. I stayed with Nettie for 7 months. I want to say that plainly, because I don't want to minimize what those 7 months were. Not just a room. A table set for 2 at every meal. Someone asking how your day was and actually waiting for the answer. Someone who knew your history and held it gently. I moved out in early June into a 1-bedroom in Stony Creek. A proper lease in my name, first and last from my own savings, a key that was only mine. On moving day, she sent me off with a tin of butter tarts and a card that said only. I always knew. The years between 27 and 35 were not uncomplicated. There were months when the budget was tight, and the math required more faith than certainty. There were moments when the next step looked unreasonably large from where I was standing. When the sensible thing seemed like staying put and waiting for a better time that I could feel in my gut was never actually going to arrive on its own. Every time I came close to talking myself into stopping, I'd think about Nettie's kitchen table. The soup. The way she'd listened without performing sympathy, without turning my crisis into an opportunity for advice. You do not stop trying when someone has already made that kind of quiet bet on you. It feels dishonest to the story you're living. I got my property management license through ORIA, took every course I could fit around my working hours, evenings, weekends, whatever was available, for 2.5 years. Learned the Ontario legislation end to end, learned the financing structures, how to read a lease and a balance sheet and a market report, and come out the other side knowing what the numbers actually meant. Built relationships carefully with people I actually wanted to work alongside. By the time I was 31, my employer offered me a partnership stake. I took it. Over the following 4 years, we grew the portfolio steadily. I was not interested in growing it any other way. I had been on the wrong end of a housing situation, and I understood, better than some of my colleagues, that every property we managed was someone's home. We maintained things properly. We responded to people. We did it right, and doing it right turned out to compound in ways that eventually made us something worth having built. By 35, I was in a position to make a move of my own. I had been watching a building in North Burlington for nearly 6 months. Newer construction, well managed. A 2-bedroom unit on the 7th floor with a south-facing balcony, and a view of the Niagara Escarpment that changes color through the seasons in ways you don't get tired of. The unit had been sitting just below what I could justify, and then in March the numbers aligned. I knew exactly who I was buying it for. I put in the offer on a Tuesday. The deal closed in April. I spent the following 2 weeks getting the place ready before I said a word to anyone. Furniture chosen for the space. The balcony set up with a small table and 2 chairs. The kitchen stocked with things she'd recognize. I remembered her saying once, offhand, maybe 6 years earlier in passing, that she'd always wanted a balcony for her morning coffee. Somewhere she could sit outside without looking at the parking lot of the variety store across from her bungalow. I don't think she remembered saying it. I had not forgotten. I organized a dinner at my place in Hamilton, told everyone it was to celebrate good news on the business side, which was not untrue, just incomplete. My father came. My stepmother came. My older sister came. And Nettie came in a plum-colored cardigan, calling me from the parking lot to ask whether she should bring the butter tarts she'd baked, because she'd done a double batch. And her daughter, in Victoria, wasn't coming until Christmas. Yes, I said, absolutely bring the butter tarts. The dinner was good. We ate well and the conversation moved easily the way it does, when everyone is making a reasonable effort. My father was in a comfortable, expansive mood, the kind he gets when things are going his way, and the room feels like his. At some point, looking around my apartment with that particular expression that is not quite pride but is something adjacent to it, he said, "I always knew you'd sort yourself out, Waverly. You've got too much of your mother in you to stay stuck. Too much of your mother in you." I looked at him across the table, and I thought about everything I could have said. I thought about November, about the Canadian Tire parking lot at 3 in the morning, about the guest room in Mississauga, empty through the entirety of November, just waiting for his in-laws in December, about how small the ask had been, about how easy yes would have been. I didn't say any of that. I said, "I've had a lot of help from the right people." And I looked at Nettie when I said it. She caught it. She'd known me long enough to hear exactly what I wasn't saying. After dessert, I asked everyone to move to the living room. I had a small wrapped box sitting on the bookshelf. White paper, a yellow ribbon. Because yellow is Nettie's color, has been for as long as I've known her, and her kitchen curtains have been yellow for 20 years at least. I brought it over and held it out to her. She looked at me the way she does when she suspects I'm up to something. "What is this now, Waverly?" "Open it." She did. Inside was a key on a simple ring and a card with an address on it. The building in North Burlington, Unit 714. The one with the south-facing balcony and the view of the escarpment. She stared at the card for a long time. The room went completely quiet. "Waverly. The deed is in your name. It's been yours since the day I signed the offer." She started to cry the way people cry when something breaks loose inside them that they weren't braced for. Not neatly. Not in the composed way that photographs well, but fully and without any attempt at containment. She kept moving her head like she was forming an objection, and I kept meeting each one with a steady shake of my own, until she stopped arguing, and just held onto my hand with both of hers, and didn't let go. My father sat very still in the armchair by the window. I looked at him. Not with anger. I had spent years making a deliberate peace with what he had and hadn't done, and I was not going to undo that work tonight. But I looked at him clearly, and I said, "Everything good that happened to me after I was 27 started in Nettie's kitchen. I just wanted to make sure she knew that I knew." He nodded very slowly, once. He didn't say anything. I think it was the first time in my adult life that I watched him sit with the math of his own choices and find the numbers difficult. Nettie moved in on a Saturday in early May. I drove up to Dundas and helped her pack. She didn't have a lot. She had always lived lightly, but she had her things. The framed school photos from her years, with students whose names she still remembered. The collection of novels arranged in an order known only to her. The yellow curtains she'd had in her bedroom window for 15 years. The cast iron pan that had been her mother's. We loaded it all into 2 cars and spent the afternoon making the Burlington unit feel like her. That evening we sat on the balcony with tea and watched the last light settle behind the escarpment. The air was warm enough to stay outside without a jacket. She asked me at some point why I had done it. I told her the truth. Because 8 years ago I was sleeping in my car, in November, in a Canadian Tire parking lot in Hamilton, and you sent me a text that said, "Come stay," like it was the most obvious answer in the world. Like the question of whether to open your door to someone who needed a door had a long time ago and required no deliberation at all. And I have built everything I have since then. And I have built everything I have since. The license, the partnership, the ability to sit here tonight. On the foundation of 7 months in your spare room. I wanted you to have something built on that foundation too. She was quiet for a long time. She held her mug in both hands and looked at the ridge of the escarpment going dark against the sky. Then she said quietly, "Your mother always knew who her neighbors were." I think my mother did know. I think that's part of why, when the worst thing happened and she was the one who was gone, she'd left the right people behind. Some people are there for the comfortable parts of your life. They show up when the cost is low and things are going well. They tell you you're capable, they may even mean it. But what they're really communicating is that your capability is convenient for them. That it frees them from having to do anything. They dress it up as confidence in you. And sometimes they believe that's what it is. And then there are people who look at the exact same situation and give a different answer. Not because they have more resources or more space or more to offer. Nettie's house was smaller than my father's house. Her income was modest. Her life was full on its own terms. What she had was a different set of values about what you do when someone you care about needs a door opened. She had decided, a long time ago, what kind of person she was going to be in those moments, and she never seemed to find it complicated. My father's answer is still in that house in Mississauga. In the guest room kept tidy for December visitors. In the careful arithmetic of inconvenience. Nettie's answer is on a balcony in Burlington, facing south, in the early morning light. With a cup of coffee and the whole Niagara escarpment laid out in front of her. Like something she was always meant to see. That is the whole story. If someone opened their door when your own family kept theirs closed. Comment. She opened the door. Because I think more of us know exactly what that means than ever say it out loud. And if you're the person right now sleeping in your car, or on a borrowed couch, or carrying something that feels too heavy to carry alone, please hear this. The right person exists. They may not be who you were counting on, they almost never are, but they are watching for you. And when they reach out, they mean every word.